Hey everyone, Ross Marchand here, Vice President of Policy at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. And there has been a lot going on in the news concerning immigration and, in particular, U.S. immigration based programs. And joining us to discuss and dissect some of the latest news is Daniel DiMartino. He's a researcher over the Institute for the Study of Free Enterprise. Daniel, how are you doing today?
Hey Ross, good and you?
Doing well, doing well. There is so much to unpack with this subject, but let's start with sort of a broad overview. If you were interested in coming to work for a US-based employer, how exactly does that work? And I know that you faced some of these difficulties and hurdles coming to work yourself for a US-based employer. So how exactly does that process unfold?
Well, there are many paths. It is important to understand that there are two different paths regarding employment, main big concerns or areas. And one is just getting directly a green card, which is to get an immigrant visa, to get a green card into the US. And that's a very lengthy and costly process. And that would just make someone directly a permanent resident. Those are not the visas that are under being challenged right now by the administration. We're talking about H-1B, we're talking about OPT, we're talking about H-2A, H-2B. These are all visas that are non-immigrant. They do not involve granting anyone permanent residence. They're fixed term based visas that allow someone to work. Now, most of these visas are, you need an employer to sponsor you. It's not like you are gonna come from out of the United States and you're just gonna say, I'm gonna find work in the country. You can't do that as a legal immigrant. Only a few exceptional, skilled, perhaps Nobel Prize winners or highly acclaimed scholars can do that kind of thing. So those are the two main areas, right? Non-immigrants and immigrants.
Okay, sure. Now, going in just the work-based visa direction, this is where we've been hearing probably the most news recently. And we've been hearing that the Trump administration is looking at limiting in some way H-1B and OPT visas. So what have you been hearing about recent news?
Well, what's going on is that since the president issued his last executive order on April 22nd, which its goal is to prioritize American workers because of the terrible coronavirus pandemic that has destroyed the US economy, the Department of Homeland Security, specifically USCIS, that's the agency that issues all these visas, is looking at limiting or eliminating two things or suspending two things. One of them is the OPT program that stands for Optional Practical Training. And it is not a visa in itself, it's part of the student visa, the F1 visa. That's the most common student visa where more than 1 million people are in the United States right now. And it allows students who graduate US colleges with bachelor's, associates, PhDs, or master's degrees to work in the United States for either 1 year or 3 years if they're STEM graduates. If this program is eliminated, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of current workers and millions of future workers that wouldn't be able to come here, and that over 2/3 of them currently have PhDs or master's degrees. So we're talking about limiting the entry of the most highly educated and productive people into the United States. And the H-1B visa, it just brings skilled workers that they all have bachelor's degrees, and it's only actually 85,000 per year. And then there's several others that are cap exempt, so they don't count towards those 85,000. But they're also like the OPT workers, right? Highly skilled workers that every economic study has shown that they increase productivity and innovation in the economy.
Sure, right. And if we're talking about the economic sort of base arguments here, something that we encounter frequently, and Daniel, I'm sure you hear this line of argument all the time, is the good old fashioned, they're taking our jobs and we need to stop the flow of these jobs to people who were not born in the US. So first of all, how often have you encountered this line of argument? And second of all, what do you make of it?
Well, I think I encounter it almost every day. And it's a very tempting argument, right? It's the classic supply and demand argument. You just see that there's more workers, there's the same number of jobs, therefore these people are replacing Americans. We have to look further than that. There's not a fixed number of jobs, just like the entry of women in the labor force didn't take away jobs from men. The entry of immigrants in the labor force do not take jobs from native workers, right? I like to do that comparison because if it was true that immigrants take away jobs from Americans, then we wouldn't want anybody to be born anymore in the United States, right? Because that would reduce unemployment. The reality economically is that these additional workers are sought by US firms. Why do they seek them? Because they think that these are the most productive workers for their companies. And if you limit the entry of workers that are more productive, then you're going to get companies that have higher costs, so prices are going to go up of goods that they produce, or they're just going to hire less people that those workers could support as well. For example, if you hire an engineer from India, that engineer is not the only thing that person brings, right? That person is going to design new buildings. Who are going to build those buildings? All other Indian workers? No, Americans are going to build those buildings. So they create jobs for others as well.
Right. And it's one thing to have the argument, and I think, right, and I'm trying to be as humble as possible here, but I think that our arguments really do win the day, Daniel. But the question is, right, how do we talk about productivity? Do you think the best way to go about it is through example, or how do you get through to the other side to convince people about the wisdom of these work-based programs?
I think the best way to persuade about it is, why would companies seek them if it wasn't that they were the best workers? Many argue that it is because they're cheaper, but then that's false, right? We're talking about wages that are usually above $100,000 all of the time, above the median wage. We're talking about people who are highly paid. If you wanted to actually shut them off, it's true that the workers in those specific industries who are American, they would actually see their wages increase by a lot. Right. But that would mean that we would have a lot less engineers in this country, would have a lot less college professors who educate Americans in this country. And while a few Americans who already get paid a lot of money would get paid a lot more, it is the average worker, it is the low-income American who would lose off from restricting immigration. George Borjas at Harvard, who's a very famous scholar on immigration, and who's no fan of open borders, by the way.
No, certainly not.
He has actually said that high-skilled immigration into the country reduces economic inequality because it raises the wages of low-income Americans and it reduces somewhat the wages of the most rich Americans.
So clearly, between Borjas and virtually every other subject, right, under the sun, right, everyone is weighed in on these sorts of issues. But if we're trying to learn more about the subject, where can we find you and your organization's work?
Yeah, you can find us at, so the Institute for the Study of Free Enterprise, it's isfe.uky.edu. We're hosted inside the University of Kentucky. You can also just look us up on Twitter. It's at UK ISFE. So UK as University of Kentucky, and then ISFE or acronym. And yeah, you can find my work as well by Googling me and going to my website, danieldimartino.com. And at ISFE, we do many things, usually related to free enterprise and those things, but immigration is a big issue, right? And we need to talk about immigration because it is not just about freedom to sell and buy goods, it's also about freedom to work. That's part of freedom, economic freedom.
Absolutely, right. And it's more important than ever to remind people that that is a core fundamental economic freedom. We're also doing a lot of work on this, Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Our website is protectingtaxpayers.org. So feel free to visit both of our organizations' websites to find more about this pressing issue. And I'm sure we will have a lot more news and information coming down the pike soon. Well, thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you.